Okay.
As soon as I see that we are streaming. It was the previous one. Yeah. So we are streaming. That's great. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And I'm glad to announce that we still continue our project Bordering, Debordering, Rebordering, and today we have a great speaker, and I'm sure that the majority of you know her. So Dr. Jessica Zhehovich, and she's the director of the Fulbright program in Ukraine and Institute of International Education. And before we start, I want to thank the Embassy of the US in Ukraine for supporting this project, as well as a lot of other projects implemented by Ukrainian Fulbright circles. So we continue, and we have a few more speakers ahead, and the conference in Lviv. I will share the information about the conference on our official website and UFC webpage on Facebook. So today we are talking about the new book. It's new academic anthology featuring 5 Fulbright Ukraine alumni. It's Freedom Taking Place, Women, War, and Culture at the Intersection of Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. Thank you, Jessica, for joining the project and for sharing your ideas. So the floor is yours, but I want to ask our viewers to leave their questions under this video, under the stream, and we'll be able to answer them at the end of the lecture, if there are any questions, of course. Okay, so thank you. We may start.
Great. Thank you, Oksana, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I should say, firstly, that my research is not representative of Fulbright program or U.S. Embassy. It is my voice as a scholar and a citizen and an individual. So this particular book that I'm going to talk about today is an anthology of 13 chapters with a total of 15 authors. And some of the chapters were co-written. That's why I have more authors than chapters. There are 8 of us working on Ukraine who all contributed chapters. I am the editor of this anthology, and I will tell you how the idea came about. And there are 4 scholars from Poland in this project and 3 from Belarus. The scholars here are numerous, and as Oksana mentioned, 5 of us plus 1, actually 6 of us are Fulbright alumni, and we already knew each other, many of us, before we became Fulbrighters or Fulbright alumni, but this is not a coincidence that it has brought us together, because all of our work and our research orbits around questions on women and gender in particular within the cultural spheres and cultural production over the last century. But there are also a majority of themes in the book and chapters concerning the past 20 years in Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. Our scholars here that I will mention, some of them who you probably know, who are in our Fulbright community, are our alumni, Katerina Yakovlenko, who's now working at Spilne as the editor-in-chief and has enjoyed scholarships and residencies at various institutions, most recently University College London. There's Maria Mayerchik and Olga Plahotnik, who are both Fulbright alumni. They are currently in Germany at Greifswald University, and they were in University of Alberta in 2018, around the time I was also there as a research fellow, and around the time when I started this project. The other alumna who has been very central to this is Irina Shuvalova. Everyone knows she's very respected, well-known Ukrainian poet, and now is starting a fabulous fellowship at University of Oslo in Norway. Irina was working on the research of music, in particular expressions of gender and femininity and gender identity within performances in Donbass in 2014 and beyond, since the war started. And this was the topic of her dissertation at Oxford. She and I, in 2018, were both researching. I was also in contact with Donbass Studies Group, and we were researching this region and cultural production in Luhansk and Donetsk. And that is really where the idea of this book started. So Irina is big inspiration for how this book began. And we formed a panel at the ACES conference that year, 2018, to look at cultural production during wartime in 2014, long before the large-scale escalation. So much of this book is a prologue to cultural production during wartime now. It takes a long view of not only cultural protection, but more the interactions and how different themes and conversations shift around the question of rights, of access by different populations, in particular women in our context, women's access to institutions to support their projects. For example, there are fabulous chapters here by Joanna Dubkowska-Kubaska. She is probably the only scholar writing about the late 19th century in this book, and she focuses on Polish art history, looking at how women actually became the first curators in the Congress Kongresówki in Warsaw at the late 19th century, because the profession of art was emerging at that time. And in fact, it was not such a great deal to be a curator because the collectors were the ones who had more of the means of definition of the field. But this changed later. So she's doing a great service for the rest of us in the book who are writing about the 20th century and tracing, and 21st, tracing some of the professionalization of culture throughout this period, which also includes very tumultuous times in World War II. Magdalena Furmanik and Małgorzata Jankowska, who are at Małgorzatas professor at Academy of Fine Arts in Gdansk, and Magdalena Furmanik is at Polish Institute of World Studies. They look at World War II and post-World War II Polish cultural production among artists. They trace a long history all the way up to contemporary artists in Poland, in particular looking at the protests of 2020 and 2021 and the question of the abortion ban and the organizing around this in Poland, which is also the topic of the chapter by Dr. Agnieszka Graf, who's professor at University of Warsaw and very well-known voice in Polish and Central European studies more broadly around feminism in Poland. So we're really glad that she joined this project because she has written really the definitive history on her own book about the protests in 2020, 2021, which in Poland were the largest demonstrations, street mobilizations since 1989. And all of you are probably well aware that same year, end of 2020 and through 2021, there were mobilizations in Belarus by women who ended up aligning themselves with the opposition movement after Lukashenko's re-election. And the three Belarusian scholars here, Verana Lapucka, who is was at the time of writing at the Graduate School for Social Research, Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at Polish Academy of Sciences, and then I believe also had a fellowship at U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Werenika does the most significant work among the three Belarusian experts on the role of women within the electoral system in Belarus and how gender has been sort of manipulated, not only in the protests, but within the establishment. And she traces by name different officials, women officials, who have manipulated or appropriated language of women's rights and freedom in order to take this language away from the demonstrators in 2020, 2021, and co-opt it for the totalitarian stable structures that have guaranteed Lukashenko's power. So it's a very informative piece that she writes and provides also great information there about some of the digital tools and specific independent media in Belarus that has supported the opposition for many years, and new links and different ways that have arisen to keep them together. So she published or finished writing this chapter. Also, we were all finishing this book as the war in Ukraine was escalating last year. So there were some updates we had to make to our chapters. And one of the things she added also to hers was the different ways that activists in Belarus were aligning themselves with support for Ukraine, and talking a little bit about the digital landscape that was happening in. And this is very interesting and important, I think, for not only our book, and I'll get to, once I give you some more of the overview here of what's going on in the book, I will get to the main theory that coheres all of our chapters together. But it's also about borders, the topic of this lecture series that Kolo is supporting, and all of the scholars contributing here, thoughts about borders in our contribution to our community's discussion here. We are looking at borders, not on territories necessarily. We're getting outside of the idea of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus as only the 21st century geopolitical borders, but looking at the economic and internet information borders, and the real gatekeeping, professional gatekeeping, and other kinds of blocks against women's organizing around different rights, or even aligning themselves with sort of global conversations about human rights. And human rights in our book are very much the same as women's rights. And actually, I will tell you in a moment as well. Once I present the theory of the book, I will present some of the key historical background in Ukraine that those 8 of us in this book, 8 of us experts on Ukraine, all are working within. We are all following very, very closely for years in our work, all the developments in the 2000s on a legislative level and with international NGOs in Ukraine, working on gender equality and guaranteeing and promoting women in professions and in other domains, public domains. So there are very specific policies that have changed over the last 20 years in a positive direction for women in Ukraine. And those policies have set precedents for human rights policies in Ukraine. They've come sometimes before the human rights and anti-discrimination policies. And now altogether, we can look at these developments and see patterns and follow that possibly into the future in the rebuilding of Ukraine. And in, I would say, quoting Kolo's wonderful title of this series, in the rebordering or debordering of the limits to women's freedoms and women's rights. So this is something that all of the authors in this book share from Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus is a value, actually, a value system that looks at the women's movement not as one thing, but as a phenomenon across countries. And we can expand this beyond Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, and certainly in the US, we have a lot that we need to look at in terms of these patterns. But the patterns now, since approximately 2016, tend to often overestimate the opposition and the women's opposition to a incumbent presidential administration, and the demonstrations by women as filling in or standing in for an opposition. This happened in my native US, where the march against Trump was the women's march. So there was no separate place for women's organizing. It was lumped into the opposition to the president. So some of this is not yet completely understood or studied, and we are not here in our book diagnosing this phenomenon or prescribing directions to move or analyzing policies that might emerge. But we are pointing out a pattern that is a foundation for future research. And the pattern is very, very clear in Eastern Europe, and in particular, where you have in these countries, Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, you have a lot of disinformation campaigns going from the Kremlin that are directly impacting women and gender movements throughout the late 2000s, but even earlier, and growing increasingly critical in the years of the war. And Ukraine in this book is the primary focus, with 8 of us working on Ukraine. And we all mention and discuss information and disinformation within our value system, as I said, shared value system, in studying women's movements. Because, as I mentioned, Veronika Laputska's case shows in Belarus, her case studies and her examples during the re-election of Lukashenko, that there are state administrative bodies working to actively suppress any kind of public peaceful demonstration. And this is also disinformation. It's not only Kremlin driven, but it's a kind of complete closure of media space and controlled and active suppression of public assembly and freedom of speech. So that is why we really felt it was so important to include Belarus in this book, not as drawing a parallel between Ukraine or Belarus or Poland or women's struggles in these countries, because they're very different, each one, but to show that there are shared lessons that we need to benefit from in research, and comparative contexts are extremely enriching for all of us, I think, who are working on these issues in their contemporary forms. What about culture? So the cultural aspects, culture being something that is sometimes thought of as not political or not important enough to think about when you have serious issues, human rights on the table, and marches in the street. In these chapters, culture is not a institution. It is a heuristic or a clue or a language through which communication happens between generations, sometimes in the chapters like what Natalia Chermalech, who is an anthropologist originally from Ukraine, now at University of Geneva in Switzerland, where she completed her PhD. And she looks very closely in her work at the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, where she participated in Kyiv, her native city. And in this chapter, she talks about film quite a bit, in the role of film in communicating about the revolution between generations who participated there, and also to Western countries. There were at least a dozen films made about Maidan. All of you have probably seen all of them, and have those you don't like at all in the way they represented events, or others that you felt were really moving. And here she's talking about the film collective of young filmmakers from Ukraine, Babylon 13, and their film called Maidan Rough Cut, which was actually a bunch of short films that each of them made and put together in a collage. And this resulted in a very powerful storytelling tool about the different narratives, different populations on Maidan, without becoming a closed conclusion. So that is one example of how culture in this book is about not making conclusions, but a representation of different narratives and how those narratives are shifting. And another very, I think, valuable contribution here has been the chapter by Oksana Brukovecka, who has become and remains a very, very important cultural figure in Kyiv and beyond, having formerly been working quite a bit, still works quite a bit with the Visual Culture Research Center in Kyiv, which organizes the biennial, the Kyiv Biennial, and participates in all of the Eastern European visual culture biennials. So she really has a lot of firsthand experience in cultural diplomacy. And her book that she's working on now will soon be published. So I hope everybody will keep their eye out for what Oksana Brukovecka is doing. She, in this anthology, has a piece that is thematically connected to what she's going to be publishing soon. It's about race and the history, and she's writing about the 90s and earlier history of Soviet language for race and culture, for culture that is outlawed, or culture that is seen as primitive from African cultures, and how the Soviet policies were utilizing these discourses of actually colonialism within their management of culture in the Ukrainian Republic. So that piece is also based a lot on her analyses of different propaganda posters about friendship of nations policies that the Soviets proposed and actively enforced. And she looks at the way individuals are represented from Asia, from Africa, from different parts of the world, and the hierarchies, the cultural hierarchies that were established. And she's really unpacking and unraveling some of this, and also speaking as an artist more than a scholar. In her piece, she's speaking as an artist and as a curator with a lot of experience in Ukraine and throughout Europe, representing Ukraine in a new way, and doing so as herself a proclaimed feminist. She proclaims herself a feminist, representing Ukrainian women and Ukrainian women's struggles for different changes they would like to see. So those are some of the main themes. There are a lot more, but I also wanted to mention here the other person in the other contributor to this book, who is not a scholar, but a artist and curator, is Antonina Stebur. And she is originally from Minsk. She's one of the 3 Belarusian contributors. She was exiled from Belarus and came to Ukraine as a refugee in 2021 because she had mounted an exhibit in Belarus that was very critical of Lukashenko's policies during COVID. And so he kicked her out and all the other curators who made that exhibit about him during COVID. And she ended up creating in Mistetsky Arsenal, National Museum of Ukraine in Kyiv, which you all know, the very big exhibit in May 2021. She was one of a team of 5 curators there called Art Everyday Resistance, and named Каждый день, one of the slogans of the protesters in Belarus. And this exhibit, I attended it in person. It was much more than art, we can say. It was a archive of letters and photographs and all kinds of documents by the marchers in Belarus who had been in jail. Many of the images were created in jail by imprisoned women, a lot of them writing about their children as well. Children were part of this whole exhibit, this kind of like understanding of the risks they were facing at the time in their protests. So I would say here in her work, what she's doing, what she's writing about is actually not that exhibit that she did in Kyiv. She's writing about something else in this book, but it's related. She's talking about contemporary Belarusian art and gender and the role that gender now plays, which is growing even more, the consciousness around gender divisions in Belarusian society since the women's marches in 2021, the Saturday marches, as they were called. Drawing all of this together, how to write the introduction to this book was a big challenge for me. I didn't know if I could really encapsulate everything that's going on in all of these amazing chapters and all of the different, levels of expertise and types of, the methodologies really that are here, because we are publishing this in a series. We publish it in a series for sociology at Vernon Press, which is an excellent peer-reviewed academic press. We had 3 expert external professors in the US review it and went through 3 rounds of editing by all of these peer reviewers. And we don't know who they are because that was organized by the press. It was a blind peer review. But the themes that really stood out and linked us in our conversations and in reading and then writing all of these threads is the focus on democracy as an imagined space between these 3 countries. So the regional links between the opposition movements in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus were not totally spontaneous in 2020, 2021, that the women's movements in these countries have been globalized for 20 years. The marches, the women's marches in Warsaw and in Kyiv have been going on since 2011 in Kyiv and even earlier in Poland with the Manifa marches. And the friendships and the knowledges and the institutions and the NGOs and the grants and the even embassies supporting foreign embassies in both countries from around the world, mostly Europe and US and Canada. But all of this support is not just spontaneous. It's been something that people have been organizing, working on, publishing for decades. And there are grandmothers now in this process. One of them is Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak, who was director of Fulbright Ukraine back in 2000, 2006. There is a theme here also of language. So not only sociology and social science patterns and data that we're working with here, but also a visual language of the actual pieces of art that we are analyzing. The book has about 50 illustrations. They're in color in the digital version, but not in the print version, unfortunately. I would really like to see this book come out in paperback, and I would like us to have many readers. So if for any reason you would like a copy of it, you can write to me and I will find a way to get it to you. The languages that have developed, and I think Agnieszka Graf's chapter does an amazing job analyzing and outlining this in Poland, and I think all three countries have this. They are what she calls a new poetics of womanhood, or a new performance also of identities. And among younger generations, especially, it looks totally different than older generations. There is now a rejection completely of the idea of a feminist wave, having, first wave feminism, second wave feminism, and attaching yourself to this. That was in the 90s, and now the younger generation says, I'm not part of any wave. There's also really rejection of the word feminism itself. It's something that we study here in tracing this language, the language also of the far right and its rise in 2016 is studied in this book. Maria Majerczyk, Olga Plahotnik do a great job analyzing that. And I should mention Maria and Olga have started feminist critique at Kritika. This is one of Ukraine's best and most prolific journals for the study of feminism in Eastern Europe. And they publish there in Ukrainian and in English. This journal has been going now, I think, for almost 10 years. So between Maria and Olga and Agnieszka's chapters, we see this new poetics of identity as one that has become very contentious, sometimes involving performances of reenacting some gendered violence. There is also a very important history of the hashtag "Я не боюся сказати," I'm not afraid to speak, or in the US, this was hashtag #MeToo, which came later actually than the Ukrainian one. I know from Tamara Martsenyuk's writing on this. That is a good example, this hashtag phenomenon of the languages now, which people are communicating in about their rights as women. And it's important for scholars to trace this and to understand how it fits in larger legislative structures, which have been, as Oksana Kish in Ukraine has pointed out, they have been shifting quite a bit in response to activism, which is a very healthy sign of a healthy democracy, because if you have real value on public opinion and social organizing, then takes those opinions of different groups in society and is able to lobby or make changes in different ways, this is progress. This is how the ideas here are really working. There's not among all of these scholars, there's not a consensus on a left-right political spectrum. We're not tracing that in Poland, Ukraine, or Belarus. We're not trying to measure levels of democracy, openness. We are citing other projects that do that, like Freedom House or the OSCE or UN Women. There are a lot of other organizations that measure opinion and measure levels of access to rights. And we're not measuring in this book, we are describing. And I would say also the role of information here is important, because what we're trying to do also is put forward a new pathway in our academic fields. In our field of Ukrainian studies, through which we work interdisciplinarily to understand Ukraine in a global context, not only limited by its territorial borders, but also connected to conversations, let's say, of the women's movement in Canada. This is important because we are making contexts now throughout this book that are changing rapidly in wartime. And what we have done that's really valuable is we have already started in 2015 working on looking at gender and change in wartime. We've already started this. We've created a kind of step one in the methodology that we are working with interdisciplinarily. In my chapter, I talk about Canada and Canadian Ukrainian legacies in feminist and women's thinking and writing in that context. In particular, I look at a contemporary Ukrainian artist, Lesya Homenko, from the 2000s, from the group Revolutionary Experimental Space in Ukraine, which is very well known. And I also look at a writer and a painter, more known as a painter, Nataka Hussar, from Canada and of the Canadian Ukrainian diaspora. And now they've met each other, which is kind of amazing because they didn't know each other before I brought them together. But in looking through both of their cultural experiments and conversations with their contexts, I see Ukraine as an imagined place for both of them because they are also creating and imagining the cultural heritages of their locations, one being Canadian, Ukrainian, folk pastoralist culture and immigration, the narrative of immigration. And in Homenko's case, the legacies of Kyiv modernism of the early 20th century set against the backdrop of today. And in between, in the 90s, there was Solomia Pavlichko, who went to Canada, went to Edmonton, where I was writing my chapter. And she, most of you know Solomia Pavlenko's very famous work, Letters from Kyiv, which really solidified her as an author. And she was self-proclaimed feminist as well from Ukraine. And these letters from Kyiv were her writings about the fall of the USSR, which she witnessed, and she turned in her party card to the Writers' Union on the same day as Brukovetsky, Oksana's father, Oksana Brukovetsky, in this book. So there is a kind of intellectual connection between all of these people. And Pavlenko, writes a lot in her Letters from Kyiv about this sort of imagined space between Ukraine and Canada, because she had just left Canada after a fellowship there for a year and went to Kyiv, and then right away, it was 1991 and the Soviet Union was ending, and she was observing everything up front. And she was writing to Bohdan Kravchenko. He's the addressee of all of these letters, the very famous historian at University of Alberta at the time. And all of the letters were translated by Myrna Kostash, the well-known Canadian Ukrainian author who I know very well, and she is in Edmonton now. So while I was there in Edmonton, I spoke a lot with Myrna, learned a lot from Myrna about the history of feminism there, because Myrna Kostash was part of the 1970s, 1980s generation in Canada, setting up the first Canadian Ukrainian Studies Center there, and also actively promoting women's rights and aligning themselves with feminist movements in Canada and in the Canadian Ukrainian diaspora, which served to support many defectors from the USSR and famous dissidents and individuals like Solomia Pavlichko. So I was able to see this living history. And I know from speaking to Myrna Kostas that when Solomia Pavlenko finished her letters from Kyiv, she was supposed to work on a feminist anthology. She wanted to create an anthology of feminist writing about Ukraine, but she died very suddenly and very young, and she was not able to do that. So part of my motivation in creating this anthology is her, actually, Solomia Pavlychko, because I would really like to see more writing and more voices from Ukraine like hers, and like Oksana Zabushko, and like all of the writers in this book. So that is where the true motivation for this came from, is from her. And we don't have that much time left, so I want to at least give the floor for questions if there are any questions.
Well, as far as I can see, I will check once more, but there are no questions yet. But as a rule, as the experience shows, people watch us afterwards, not when the stream is, but a few days later, etc. So just a second, because there are a lot of links open here, and just to be sure that there are no questions, I have to check once more. No, unfortunately, there are only likes and shares for now. But I thank you a lot for such a great presentation. Jessica, there is no sound on your side.
Okay, I was going to say, well, if there are no questions, I'll take the moment to show just a few visuals. I will share my screen first and show here. I want to share, this is the cover of the book. And yeah, you can see it's a very striking sketch. Yeah. This is by Lesa Humenko, the contemporary.
Just wanted to ask who's the author, yeah.
And it appears at the end of my chapter. What it is actually is a carbon paper, carbon block. So there were many sketches that were created over this one. Lesa was on the Maidan in 2013, 2014, and she drew faces of people that she saw on the Maidan, and many faces layered over each other are what you see here. So this is like it's a palimpsest, essentially a layering of many different drawings. And this is the residual carbon paper. It's in her series called Drawing on Maidan, and the whole series is at the Maidan Revolution of Dignity Museum in Kyiv. So that's where this cover comes from, but I also wanted to show you, here's Pavlenko. That's something different, but those of you listening probably know this painting. And this, I want to show you here some examples of what I'm talking about with contemporary Ukrainian art and artists responding to the war in their works. All of these artists listed here were part of an exhibit that I co-curated with my colleague Grace Mahoney this year at University of Michigan. All of the works were created in 2022. Here we have the title, I Have a Crisis for You, which is also the title of a poem by the very well-known Ukrainian poet, Luba Yakimchuk, whose book Apricots of Donbass was also part of our exhibit. So we had a literary component. Here you can just see some works by Oksana Brukovetsky, and anyone who's interested in following up on your own, this website is open access. If you Google I Have a Crisis for You, University of Michigan, it will come right up. And we have lots of artifacts here, but you could see she has been creating war rugs. These are textiles about the war, and much of the themes concern violence, certainly. And I know that now these will soon travel to Łódź in Poland at the Textiles Museum there. But it's important to mention this medium the use of textiles being a very significant one for women's feminist art since the 1970s, because if you look at the long history of art globally concerning women and women's rights, textiles are a large part of the development of the conversation around gender in culture, because textiles were always women's work, working in the factories, sewing, embroidering, tailoring. This was the work of women. So it's a way of kind of commenting also on women's labor and the creative and intellectual labor of artists and scholars having historically been banned to women. Women have had to fight to gain access to the production to become an artist, as we know all very well. The way of signing poems anonymous, in the 19th century was probably more or less how most women existed at the time. You can see also here very well-known emerging, not emerging, now established, but a young artist, Katarina Lisovenko, and her works in response to the war often cast as mythological or even Grecian epics about civilization. So here she has these sort of centaurs and the title, "I do not want to live in a world that reproduces collective nameless graves. I am against it." Again, you can see a kind of almost early Mesopotamian or Meso idea of the gathering of the table, kind of Judeo-Christian also themes of the Last Supper. But what I really also like and appreciate about her work is the motherhood that she depicts oftentimes in her pieces of the juxtaposition of life and death, of birth, of taking care of a young child, and placing, a mother with a young child in a cemetery. This kind of juxtaposition of living and existing with one's child and family in the context of the war. That's really where her work is quite powerful. And she has been exhibiting also recently in Ukraine. I know that she had an exhibit in Kyiv a couple of months ago at Naked Gallery. And another person who is working with the theme of women and children and putting children at the center of the experience of war is Oksana Kazmina. She's also a film and video artist and has had a lot of experience abroad, but she here has created a kind of violent sketch in this one diary poster. But here's her video she made called Digging, about the bombings and death of children in Ukraine during the war, and setting her kind of narrative of her film as a gravedigger on a playground is a very powerful image that we had a very lively and active discussion at University of Michigan with the audience, because as part of this exhibit, we did an artist roundtable in which all of the artists, some half of them in person and half online, participated. And she spoke quite powerfully about the landscapes of her work in the context of the war. So those are just a couple of examples, and I would hope maybe that this project can expand and we'll see more exhibits like this. There was another great exhibit called Women at War in New York by Ukrainian women artists. And I think that the experience of war is a highly gendered one, and to have a conversation about that is bringing different voices to the table and seeing in different perspectives. And I really have valued the time that I've been able to spend in the conversations with these cultural makers. Now, most of them in Ukraine, most of these artists that I showed you, and a lot of the cultural activity from the book that I presented is ongoing, and it's ongoing in Ukraine during the war. So I hope that we can continue conversations as that goes forward.
Thank you, Jessica. And one more, I don't know whether it's still been used or not, but if you still have a few minutes, I'm aware that one of your books has been already translated into Polish and published, and I have to notice that the Ukrainian version of the translation is almost ready, but of course it's too early to announce because the editor has to work on it and the publishing house, but still. I mean, the Superfluous Women, maybe you could say a few words about this book.
Yes, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine is my monograph, and has won a few awards, including the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Award and the Omelian Pritsak Award for Slavic Studies given by Harvard, and the Modern Language Association Award, which was a major one for me. This book will be published in Ukraine with Kritika Press and a Revolution of Dignity Museum Kyiv. And the Polish version is going to be published with Modern Art Museum of Warsaw and Character Press in a series that I'm very excited to be a part of, because the other books in that series are very foundational for visual theory, visual culture in Poland and in Eastern Europe. And what all of this, writing, I guess, during war time, my monograph was published in 2020. So it was published, 5-6 years into the war, but before the large scale escalation. And it was difficult to update it constantly and try to speak to every change as things were developing in different ways. So I had to think theoretically, and I think in these new editions in Polish and Ukrainian, I will write a preface and possibly invite another scholar to write a preface to this book, not just myself, but somebody else also to contribute. I like this tradition in publishing when others, join in and comment, because it's really a village. Writing a monograph is a village. It's a lot of institutions and people who have supported this work and continue to support it. And the war doesn't change that. I mean, it changes a lot of maybe content and some perspectives here and there, but the core of what we're doing as a community of intellectuals here is important, even during wartime, because Ukraine needs intellectual sovereignty. And that is a very powerful word that I owe to my colleague Timothy Brick in our recent conversations. He's also Fulbright alum, and now I believe at Kyiv School of Economics. But intellectual sovereignty is not easily won. I mean, as the women's movement can tell you, there are a lot of forces that want to take away your intellectual sovereignty and tell you how to think for yourself. You have to do it for yourself. And that's what democracy is. It's being able to act on your ideas. But intellectual sovereignty is having the means to the tools of the master and the master's house, as Audre Lorde, the great American writer, has written so beautifully. And she was also African-American. So there's a lot we can do together. And I think that we will. I know Ukraine will win the war, and Ukraine will have intellectual sovereignty, and we will have more and more young women speaking Ukrainian. So that's the goal. Я говорю теж українською. Це very, very thankful to translators. I know that translation is an art. It's really an art. So I'm very, very grateful and looking forward to be working on finalizing that translation if needed.
Thank you, Jessica. And I want to express all the gratitude to all the speakers of our project. And what I want to notice is that all those lectures that were streamed and recorded will be used as the studying materials for those students who learn border studies in UKU, for instance, Ukrainian Catholic University, and the Saarland University in Germany. And we have started working on a new website because the previous one that was devoted to the border studies was somehow connected with bad Russians or just Russians, and it doesn't work at the moment. Oh. So, yeah, I mean that these materials will be watched and rewatched more and more. So the number of viewers is not that important today as it will be in a few years, probably, or in a few months. And all these materials are very useful. And it's just a way to join the international community working on border studies. So once more, thanks for the support of this project. It's really important, not only for Ukraine, but for all of the European, and not only European, but the Western countries. And I think everyone who has joined us today and who will rewatch the video or watch it afterwards, I'll probably stop the stream and we can